Hello and welcome. Ukrainian forces have invaded Russia. Yes, that actually happened, but they're already back over the border. We will talk about this mainly, but also about the situation along the rest of the front line, like for instance around Bakhmut. Russian volunteers fighting on the side of the Ukrainian armed forces have crossed the border 2 days ago in approaching Graivoron here in Belgorod Oblast. We see it here, the Belgorod Oblast, and the attack actually happened around this axis of attack, this line here. They captured the border post, and according to their own claims, they reached Graivoron. After that, the Russians were panic was spreading inside of Russia. There were videos of Russians fleeing Belgorod, but it seems it's clear that by now the Ukrainian forces are back over the border. I call them Ukrainian forces because basically they were equipped by the Ukrainian armed forces, even though according to themselves and according to the Ukrainians, they were Russian citizens, even though by now there have also been some identified that are Belarusians. So while it might be true that non-Ukrainian citizens might have done it, it was sanctioned at least by the Ukrainian side. So for simplicity's sake, I'm going to call them the Ukrainian forces. By now they are back over the border, and we have massive propaganda spreading from both sides right now. Those pictures were spreading around of two Humvees being destroyed, and somebody analyzed it here and says that like there are no marks on it, like there's no earth being moved after they hit it. You see it here that no earth is moved, that the tire never touched the sand here, and this is a skid mark from the tire being lowered. So basically this whole thing is staged of the losses that the Ukrainians have faced here. And while the Russians say they killed 70 of the intruders and captured the rest, and they destroyed loads of equipment, the Ukrainian side, the Russian volunteer corps, are claiming they had 2 wounded. That was all. Obviously, the truth will be somewhere in the middle. Both sides have massive interest in creating a false narrative here. While it is an embarrassment to the Russians that the Ukrainians were able to cross the border, and thus they have to at least reassure the public, the audience, that they have crushed them and delivered a devastating defeat. Should the Ukrainian forces have actually suffered some losses, and there was at least one picture with a completely burned up corpse in front of it, which could be staged as well, obviously. But should they have suffered losses, then it would make sense for them to lie about it as well, to make the impression that their border raid was a complete success. We do have videos of Su-25 ground attack planes attacking the raid into the Russian territory. We know that the Russians used multiple launch rocket systems to shell the invaders, that they have sustained some losses there would just make perfect sense. So it's in my I would guess the likelihood is somewhere in between the two. So they were probably not wiped out as the Russians claim, while the pro-Ukrainian side yesterday even claimed they were advancing and they had already destroyed a whole battalion, and like it went crazy completely. The whole information sphere was filled with nonsense that couldn't make sense. A video was being spread around, they are advancing without any resistance, and I took the video and a quick look at it showed that it didn't make sense to be somewhere deep inside, and the building was fairly characteristic, and all it needed was to go in here and see that it was actually the border post here that they had reached. So the border post was them driving around the border post was spread around like the Russians are retreating further and the Ukrainians are advancing without any resistance. That's obviously nonsense, but in regard to that, it's still a massive success, because right now there are messages here from the Russian information sphere. We have here Riba. According to them, the They also crossed the border at other points. We have here claims again from Riba that they have that the Ukrainian side has reinforcements along the border. And even though Kots News here is claiming that this is not true, there were still reports that there were also advances up here, somewhere in this area, and up here as well. So basically, this was supposed to be still held by Ukrainians while they were invading at different positions as well. The majority of those informations will be utter nonsense, but as said, both sides have a massive interest in creating a false narrative. The Russian pro-Russian volunteer side want to be the highly successful one. The Ukrainian, did I say the Russian volunteers? Yeah, the Russian volunteers and the Ukrainians on the fighting on the Ukrainian side have a vested interest in claiming they are extremely successful. They don't suffer any losses. Everything is perfect. The Ukrainian general staff, which usually doesn't lie that much, was not directly involved, so we don't have a direct contradiction by it. They were just trolling the Russians that this is local persons rising up and buying equipment in local hardware stores. Basically, what the Russians were telling the public and the Ukrainians when modern Russian tanks were appearing in eastern Ukraine in 2014, where they claimed that it's locals that do an uprising while it was clearly Russian military occupying a neighboring country. So in total, the stories are made up to a vast degree. What seems to be certain is that the Russians fighting on the Ukrainian side actually penetrated into Russia, occupied a couple of towns. Those two, I think they were in Gora Podol as well. Graivoron is not confirmed that they have actually been there, so they at least captured those two towns here, occupied them, and withdrew after a certain amount of time. They were likely shelled, so it seems likely that they have actually suffered losses, but at least the pictures being shown here seem to be doctored. Somewhere in there, that seems to be more or less the truth. The whole event, while not having led to any conquered territory, might be of massive significance, because if the Ukrainians don't stop that now, and if the Americans don't stop the Ukrainians from doing that, they can basically play a whack-a-mole with the Russians along a 700-kilometer front line here, from here up to the Belarusian border, doing penetrating raids here and there, and leave the Russians only a few dilemmas, so they basically don't have a good way out. They can reinforce the whole front line, meaning that they can quickly wipe out and attack those units that could come and penetrate, but those forces needing to reinforce the border will be lacking in other parts of the front line. They can use a small mobile reserve like they did now to fight them, but that will allow the invaders to take border towns and do photo ops, get a big propaganda value out of it, even if they are being repulsed after 24 hours, or they position units along the front, along the border, close to the border, to prevent any penetration at all, which also means that they are very easy to observe and thus very easy to be attacked. So any unit that is directly along the front here that prevents the very first towns along the international border will have a permanent attrition by small drone attacks, by mortar attacks. So the Russians will suffer additional losses, and neither of those options is a really attractive solution to the problem, which means the Ukrainians have created a massive dilemma here, which will probably help them with a coming counteroffensive, as the Russians either have to send reinforcements. There are some rumors that they already do, that supposedly they already send reinforcements from somewhere down here, from southern Donetsk, to Belgorod. If they do this, then any offensive in Ukraine will have an easier time. And if they don't, then at the very least, those units, those forces that are along the international border will not really be able to be redeployed into Ukraine to fight a Ukrainian counteroffensive. So with a very small amount of material and personal use, the Ukrainian side might have gained a much bigger effect than generally would be considered out of a raid of probably 70, 80 men. That's at least the last number we more or less have. Even though There's still a problem with it because we see here it's from the Financial Times. State Department spokesman Matthew Miller said it was up to Ukraine to decide how to conduct their military operations, but that the US opposes attacks in Russian territory. We have made very clear to the Ukrainians that we won't enable or encourage attacks outside Ukrainian borders. The problem there is obviously that the attack was done using US delivered military equipment. While the tanks accompanying it were T-72s, the armored vehicles were Max Pros and Humvees from previous American deliveries, so that might cause some issues in this regard. We go to the front line itself. We have on the eastern front now, close to Kupiansk, reports about further fighting at Masyutivka, and along the front line we have some reports of sabotage groups, as they are being called, trying to penetrate into the Russian side. So the Russians are reporting small Ukrainian attacks. The Russian side is also claiming they gained some positions in the direction of Nevsky. So somewhere here they might have gained a few meters inside of the wood lines, inside of the tree lines, but that cannot be confirmed. South of the Seversky Donetsk, we have continued fighting around Bilorivka, and there is a small marginal territorial gain in the southeast of it, where the Russians have advanced a little bit. Other than that, we have fighting around Bakhmut. The Ukrainian side and military bloggers are reporting attacks from the Russians around Hyrorivka. So in this direction, at attacks on Khomove and on Ivanivske. In those directions, no successes can be reported in this regard. The Ukrainians are saying they gained 300 to 400 meters on both sides of the city. Where exactly cannot be clear. There are some claims that they've managed to advance further here in the direction of Yahidne, and others are claiming roughly this area here, especially the wooded areas here, have been cleared from Russian forces by now. I have not seen visual proof of that, so it might be true, it might not be true. I cannot fully confirm that yet. Further south we have, and Avdiivka, we have the reports of continued fighting there as well. The Russians have attacked in the direction of Novokalinove, in the direction of Siverne and Pervomaiske. Also, we have confirmation that the Russians actually gained some minor territory here, and exactly here we see that here this is a video having been recorded, and you can see this is the geolocalization. It's directly south of the this characteristic water body, but north of the river. So it should be more or less here where the Russians have positioned themselves and have advanced further. So there is some territorial gain south of Pervomaiske that can be confirmed. On the southern front, further south, we have reports of fighting at Marinka. I cannot confirm that anything has changed here in the territorial control. Also in Novo-Mikhailivka, there is Russian attacks being reported in that direction as well. Also no confirmation of change in territory. Along the southern area, we have the usual artillery duels that are happening, the Ukrainians striking positions in the deep rear and the Russians trying to do the same. For instance, they have likely destroyed a Ukrainian ammunition depot, not in the south, but in Kramatorsk a couple of days ago. So this is more or less ongoing in the background the whole time. And here south on the Dnipro, we have reports that the Ukrainians likely have captured this island here, where we see it marked in green now as well. And let's hope the stream technician doesn't destroy my sound here. But while this is also happening, there are reports that the Russians are continuing defensive works on the Dnipro, including mining and creating barriers against boats. This is it already from the front line, so the fighting has more or less died down in most directions. There are still some attacks being reported, but mostly without significant territorial gain. The big thing was obviously the capture of Bakhmut. as well as the Ukrainian counterattacks on the flanks. I don't see the Ukrainians doing a serious offensive here. They seem to be exploiting local weaknesses over the last few days. As soon as the front lines, the flanks in Bakhmut have been reinforced well enough that any further advance will be too costly, they will likely stop. At least it seems like this, unless they want to reinvigorate their attacks to draw in additional reserves to allow for the counteroffensive to happen in another place. But as of now, at least, it doesn't seem that there's a serious attempt to encircle the troops within Bakhmut. Further north, the big thing was obviously the raid or the invasion into Russia. I think if it doesn't cause diplomatic problems with the Americans, which it might be, as the use of US equipment did not make the Americans too happy, if this doesn't cause any problems, it was probably successful, even if it was bought with several KIA in this event, as it will force the Russians to put more resources on their northern front line on the northern border with Ukraine. When it comes to generally, when we generally also we have information about Bakhmut. Prigozhin, the leader of Wagner group, has said after the conquest of Bakhmut, he's going to hand over his positions in Bakhmut on the 25th to the Russian troops. Wagner will, after the 1st of June, do a rest period and training period for 2 months to replenish its forces. And we have an interesting video here that shows us a Ukrainian suicide drone trying to hit a Russian ship quite closely actually to the Bosporus. And as we can see, it was hit with probably autocannon fire and thus exploded. And the ship is, this is IBAN course, a reconnaissance ship that we can see here, and as it is considered to be an auxiliary ship, it is probably allowed to cross the Bosporus after all, as it's not considered a full-blown warship. That at least is the explanations I have read. I guess it's up to Turkey how they enforce the rules of the Montreux Treaty, but at least according to this, the ship was allowed to pass the Bosporus, and the Ukrainians attacked it fairly fast after that. When it comes to force creation, the Ukrainian General Staff is saying that the prisoner recruits on the Russian side are now only being trained for 10 days instead of 4 weeks to make up for the high losses, to basically send bodies to the front line as fast as possible. That obviously could be propaganda by the Ukrainian side. We've said it often here in the past on this channel that when it comes to statements like this, especially statements that give an indication about the overall shape of the opponent's forces, and thus statements that can raise or lower morale of one side, that we need to be specifically careful. And as the Ukrainian General Staff is obviously well known to be an active participant in that war, we need to take everything they say with some grain of salt. But at least according to them, the prisoner recruits have now a reduced training time because of the high losses. It's now supposedly reduced to just 10 days. And the Duma, the Russian parliament, has added amendments to the law about entering and leaving the Russian Federation. Now the passports of mobilized personnel, FSB workers, everyone who carries national secrets can be confiscated. Some others, I think as well, like especially if you've been called up, your passport can be taken away so you can't leave the country anymore. And if you are doing your conscription, you will only receive your passport after you're done with it. So Russia is basically taking care that any mass flight in case of a second mobilization wave, a second big mobilization wave at least, will not be possible anymore. We have also here's some interesting video. It was taken in Fürth, I think 4 days ago, 3 or 4 days ago. And what we can see here is CV9040. So the Swedish, likely from the Swedish Armed Forces, that should be camouflage netting against thermal vision. So the military aid that is it's not supposed to go anywhere else but Ukraine. Why else would it be on on trains inside of Germany if not for that very reason to be sent there? So they are likely on their way towards Ukraine now, and we have reports from Japan that Japan is going to hand over 100 trucks, military trucks, to Ukraine, which will obviously help with logistics. And while it's not weaponry, it's still a big step for Japan, who has been not even selling its weapon to nations in peace in the past decade since World War II, with one recent exception too, where they sold some amphibious planes to India, but also not weaponry. That now they send military trucks, even though it's just trucks, it's still from their military into an active war, is obviously another step of Japan showing that they take responsibility for their economic power and for their role inside of in the world. And finally, we have a news here from Rheinmetall. Supposedly, Rheinmetall is now starting to make 300,000 rounds for Ukrainian Gepard AAA, self-propelled AAAs that will be delivered following starting this autumn. There were in the past there were some issues with deliveries, as Germany had those 35mm grenades on stock, but they were of Swiss origins, and the Swiss banned the export into an active war zone. That's it from me already for now. If you enjoyed this, please hit the like button, leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support from viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much to everyone already supporting it. Your support really helps. That's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.